So, what's all the buzz about bias? Today I want to talk about bias bands, what they are, how to use them, and just in general, the best tips I could offer about bias bands. So, first of all, let's talk about what a bias band is. This is an example of a bias strip of fabric. Now, bias bands are used a lot of different ways. I tend to sew primarily children's clothing, so my examples will be of children's clothing, but the same is true if you are making adult clothing. So in this instance, a bias band is used on this blouse to attach the collar. And I have chosen to use the same fabric for the bias band as I did for the collar. You can also use contrast if you want to make a little fashion statement. Nobody sees it, but it is a nice look. And again, this also the same thing. This bias band, I've got a white collar, so I've used a white bias band here in this little boy's shirt. On a fancier dress here, I have lined the inside, so I didn't need a bias band at the collar, but I did need it at the sleeve. And you can see here I've used the same fabric, and I've got a bias band to finish off the armhole of this dress. Bias band can also be used just as a added element of design. So on this cute little top, I've used it at the sleeve edges, around the neckline, and again around the hem. And you always need a bias band at the top of a bishop dress. So I've got a contrast bias here. I've repeated it on the sleeves. It's also at the top of the pocket here. And in this dress, I've used it at the neckline edge, but I've also used it at the outside edge to finish off this smocking. So that's another instance. And again, it's used around the hem of the dress. And I've made spaghetti bias for the decorative treatment here. So all of that adds interest to a particular garment. And they can be varying widths. Right here I only needed the bias at the top edge of the sleeve, and you can see this is a very tiny bias because I didn't really want that to be very noticeable. So these are just some areas where you're going to use bias bands. You need to use bias to go all around those curves. So what is bias? Here I have an example of gingham fabric. I thought that would display very well, or it would be a good way to show an example of bias. So at the top I've got my torn edge, or you could have a cut edge here, and then on the edges you have your selve edge on both edges. To get a true bias on fabric, you have your lengthwise grain and your crosswise grain. The crosswise grain has a tiny bit of stretch, not really much. The lengthwise grain has absolutely none. So if you're going to go around a curve smoothly, you need to use bias. The way to find your bias is to take the crosswise grain and fold it so that it matches grain lines with a lengthwise grain. So it's very easy to see that on a gingham or a plaid fabric. So once you've folded it like this, you end up with this folded edge here. This is a 45-degree angle, and that is your true bias. If you have it folded somewhat at an angle, it will still stretch, but that's not a true bias. You want to use a true bias when you're cutting a bias band for anything. And on the examples that I showed, I also used a lot of piping match. So I covered the cording with the bias strips to make piping. that also should be cut on the bias so that it wraps smoothly around the cording. So once you've done that, you've got your 45-degree angle, then you can take your ruler, and the easiest way to cut bias is just to choose the width that you need and use a rotary cutter and just cut along the width, whatever you want, as many strips as you need. Now, you generally don't want to waste too much fabric, so in the instance where it's decorating around the hem of a garment, you're going to need quite a few strips to cover that hem. So let's talk about joining biases. There's a couple different ways you can join bias. So let's say you have your bias strips cut here. Now, the ideal, I've seen a lot of times where people will take a straight cut edge and put it together and stitch a seam right here. And that is not the ideal way to sew a bias. I've done that here on this example. And one of the problems, you can match up your stripes or ginghams or whatever, but one of the problems is when you stitch it straight like this, number one, you're stitching it on the bias, which is not ideal. But number two, when you attach it to a piece of fabric, you're going to stitch it, and in the case of a sleeve, it gets rolled over a few times. All of your bulk is right here at that seam line, and that's just not ideal either. The best way to attach lengths of bias together is to have the 45-degree angled edges, and you can put them together like this. I generally would try to match up the design lines. So if I pull this back a little bit, ideally you want a blue line following a blue line here, because that will give you the most invisible join. And then you would sew from this point down to this point. And when you do that, you are sewing on the straight grain, so there's no stretching involved when you sew it. And then when you open it up and press your seam open, okay, let's try to do this. You do have a beautiful match, but you can see that the seam, because it's also at a 45-degree angle, your seam allowance distribution, it's distributed different areas along, say for instance, the sleeve band where you might join it at the underarm seam. You don't have all that bulk in one spot. So one way to join it is by putting the angled edges together and stitching this way. If you have a hard time remembering that, another way that you can stitch this together is by, if you've got this straight edge here and the straight edge at the top, you lay them together to form a 90-degree angle. And then in this instance, you would sew from this corner down to here. And again, I would pull this back and make sure that my designs are matching. But then when you would fold this back after you've stitched your seam, you would just trim away this extra bulk, and you would still have your angled bias, which would distribute better along your seam line. So let's talk about width to cut your bias. It really depends on what you're making. So if you are, and your seam allowance. So if you have, say, a 1/4 inch seam allowance and you need bias band to cover cording, the baby cording that you would use on, for instance, this. So if you're going to cover this cording and your seam allowance is a 1/4 inch, you're going to need 2 seam allowances, so that's a 1/2 inch, plus you need about 1/8 inch to go around this baby cording. So you would cut your strips 5/8 of an inch wide. Now that's a hard, tiny amount to work with. I tend to cut mine wider, and then I will use a piping ruler and trim off the excess. A good piping ruler that I can recommend is made by 10 Sisters, and it has several different seam allowance widths that you can situate your piping in to trim off the extra. So here I have a couple different examples. This is a single layer of bias, a bias strip. So say you were going to go around a sleeve or a neckline. I'm working with the straight piece just because that was easier. I didn't have a neckline ready to show. If I were stitching this on the neckline, I don't pin it in place because I like to stretch it ever so slightly as I stitch around the curve. It just lays better that way. But in this one I have a 1 inch wide bias band. I've stitched a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and you need to have that 1/4 of an inch here, and then it's folded back on itself, so there's another 1/4 of an inch, so that leaves you a 1/2 an inch up here. You're going to fold a 1/4 of an inch in, and then when you fold that last time, you've got a pretty small bias band on the front side. And what's important to note when you're using bias bands, whether it's for necklines or sleeves, anytime you're using it to encase a seam, you want to make sure that this folded edge right here is exactly sitting on the top edge of the cut seam allowance there. If this is wider, or if you were to have a bigger, just fold under an 1/8 of an inch here, and it's not snug against that, that's when you end up with little ripples that go across your bias band. So you need to make sure that it is fully stuffed when you stitch it. And then of course you can hand stitch this down, and that makes a beautiful 1/4 inch bias. So you would cut your 1 inch strip of bias band fabric and use 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now you may need to add a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch of fabric for turn of the cloth, I call it, because when you turn over like this, it does take up a little space, if you will. I don't on soft fabrics like this, but if you're using something heavier like a piqué, you may need to add a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch to your bias band width so that you can turn over that heavier fabric. The other type of bias band that I use is called a French bias. And the French bias is just a wider bias strip. It's doubled over and it's sewn double. And the nice thing about that, and I have an example of that here, I've used this doubled bias, so it is stitched on double like that, and then you press it press the seam allowance towards the bias, and then when you fold this back, it just has to come back one time, and you've got that folded edge that sits right at your seam line there. This is also a nice way to use it. You don't have to mess with pressing under this little bit because you've already got this finished folded edge pressed, but there is very little, like as in no, room for error. You have to be very precise with your sewing if you're going to do a French bias, because you can't trim anything off if it's a little bit too wide. So that's my tip. So there's two different types of biases. There's lots of use for these. So if this is something new to you, I would encourage you to try it. It's a nice way to finish armholes and necklines. It can be a finish that is shown on the outside like that, but it also can be a finish where it would be turned all the way to the inside. And so I used a French bias here, and then you fold it to the inside of the sleeve, and it's finished like that. But again, that's using a little bit more fabric. It's a little bit bulkier, so it may not be suitable for all of your bias bands. And if you're going around a curve, you can see, let me take this one. You can see how this has so much stretch to it. You could actually press it into a curved shape if you needed to, and that's what I do with the spaghetti bias. It just goes around nicely, and with a good amount of steam, you get a nice press and a nice shape. So I hope that clears up any confusion about bias bands. If you enjoyed this video and you don't want to miss any of the future ones, please hit the subscribe button below.